Okay, we're here with Dr. Stanley Gontarski from Florida State University. Uh, I met him in 87, 88. I known him for a long time, almost my entire life, back in the Stone Age. And I mean, one of the books that he introduced me to in the early days, I mean, I had read a lot of the Grove books like Burroughs and Beckett and Genet, and there was other, and Beck and Joyce and Glenn O'Brien, but I didn't know about Robert Hughes, The Shock of the New. So Gontarski kind of turned me on to this, and just my whole view of the art world and painting since 1960. Well, even before that, because it's modernism is colored by the Robert Hughes the way he looked at it. Like, do you still did you how did you discover Hughes? He was just a guy around like in the 60s that you would read in the New York Times or something?
Yeah. I mean, he was very much in the air, but then there's been a lot of variation on Hughes's perspective. I mean, he was such a big hit. The parallel to that is John Berger,
Right.
who did the BBC documentary, and then published a book like The Shock of the New. So that's a sort of competing view, but Berger was strongly Marxist. All his readings were strongly Marxist. So they make an interesting contrast to Hughes. But since then, this whole field has exploded so that we're in a position now where almost no one talks about modernism anymore. They pluralize it and talk about modern isms. And so that has ramified into all sorts of subcategories. And it also helps deal with the other conflict at the time, or maybe not conflict, but the growth of what people were talking about in terms of postmodernism, which now is something of a disreputable term, because one of the things that post suggests is that modernism is finished, complete. And so there's something entirely new going on. So the people who are talking about either new modernisms or modernisms pretty much reject the idea of postmodernism because of that historical marker, the fact that it suggests that one phase is over and something else is going on. So a lot of contemporary work is called something like long modernism, but it treats modernism as a continuing rebellion rather than dividing it at some point in the 60s, say.
Yeah, I think I mean I don't really call it postmodernism. I mean, a lot of those guys like Gilbert Sorrentino and Alexander Thoreau and Robert Cooper, which they might have called postmodernism in the 80s. I mean, I just think that those guys are kind of retro modernists. They were trying to do the James Joyce or a Thomas Mann book with the story and extra knowledge, the big doorstop type novel in
Right.
the 70s and 80s. I just think that they were kind of going back. They were, because like, yeah, as you remember, the big writers of the 70s and 80s were minimalists, like Raymond
Yeah.
Carver, and that was like the
Donald Barthelme.
yeah, and they were more minimal and
Yeah.
not Vonnegut, but the other guy that Run Rabbit, I forgot his name though. But yeah, they were more minimal. So the guys that we called sort of postmodernists and were writing big books like Pynchon, we're really doing Joycean type stuff, 50 years later.
Right. And I think all of that is now very much in the mix of what we talk about in terms of post 1900 literature. So any number of theorists talking about whatever those ruptures were that Joyce and Pound pretty much initiated are continuing along one group of writers, the Don DeLillos and people of that nature.
Yeah, or Paul Auster. There's a
Yeah.
big number of them and stuff. So like the last time I talked to you, we were kind of celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Grove Press number.
It still holds up. I was looking at it just the other day. It still holds up remarkably well. And you did all the hard work on that volume because you transcribed most of the interviews in it. Saved me a lot of work.
And I became good friends with Gil Sorrentino and his son Chris Sorrentino because of it. And since then, I mean, a lot of these people that we talked to in 1989 and 90, they're no longer with us. Ferlinghetti, Barney have all gone. But since then, Steve Moore has written a book called Dalkey Days, which is more about his experiences with John O'Brien, who also died a few years ago.
He did.
And in the book, he mentions that this book had a real cool cover compared to the usual issue of the Review of Contemporary Fiction,
Yeah.
And
they broke with their generic covers with in that book.
Yeah, because
yes. Go ahead, sorry.
They were copying the French editions de minuit type of thing.
Right.
John was a big ripoff artist. He would always take something he liked, like he would take Wyndham Lewis's Blast or what Pound did or what James Laughlin did or somebody, and kind of take it to Dalkey and do the same thing with Dalkey.
Yeah, I mean, he was amazing. And of course, that cover with Barney with the famous cover from Evergreen Review in the background, that celebrated Evergreen Review moving from a European literary quarterly to a monthly glossy avant-garde magazine that is picked up by any number of other magazines, including one called Avant-Garde.
And I mean, I asked you before, like Grove Press and Dalkey Archive. I mean, these publishers don't really exist anymore. I mean, because they were really introducing. I mean, Dalkey had its hits with Felix Alfo and the David Marks and Wittgenstein's Mistress and the Sorrentino books, and they published the Arno Schmidt was pretty good, and
they revived Flann O'Brien.
Yeah.
A lot of whose lesser known books were out of print at the time, so they took their name after Dalkey Archive, a Flann O'Brien book, and were big boosters of Flann O'Brien.
And these publishers I mean, right now it's like these publishers, there's no person like we go look at Dalkey and like look at all their list or the Grove list, and we would read Burroughs or Genet just based on the publisher and stuff. There's nobody really like that in the last 25 years. I mean, we're not going to be talking about Crown Books or Henry Holt, like they're just a bunch of guys trying to make money or something.
Right.
They're almost like a university press. It's boring. It's not like a Maverick publication or anything. They don't have a thing.
But it takes a very particular kind of individual to do that. And in this late 50s, early 60s period, we had a cluster of very daring publishers. Maurice Girodias in Paris with Olympia Press, who really got everything started. John Calder in London, and Barney Rossett in New York. they were something of a triumvirate. And of course, like all groups like that, they finally wound up at each other's throats because they accused each other of not paying royalties to and the like. But those were three incredible personalities. What we have to remember about London as well is that in 1962, Rossett had not yet published Naked Lunch. Marie Giraudias did, and Calder was preparing to do it, but Calder started this Edinburgh Writers' Conference, or an extension of the Edinburgh Arts Festival, and invited in 1962 people like Henry Miller, Mary McCarthy, and William Burroughs to a conference in Edinburgh. And everything exploded from that point. And Calder has always insisted that it's that conference and the amount of attention that Burroughs got, a lot of it we would call negative attention today, but a lot of that attention is what caused Barney to really latch on to Burroughs for Grove Press.
What was Alexander Trokey was there too?
Yeah, he was part of that group as well, and he was one of the participants in that conference. And pretty famous, Norman Mailer was there as well. And of course, Norman Mailer is the one who made the comment that William Burroughs is probably the only American writer of genius. And that was much broadcast in Edinburgh as well. But Mary McCarthy, who's not exactly an avant-garde writer, became one of the big promoters of Burroughs, as Anthony Burgess in the UK. Anthony Burgess wasn't at this Edinburgh 1962 festival, but he picked up very quickly, and these people started to promote Burroughs. But if you look around today, it's hard to find publishers like that. These are people, the word that's important, these are the people who took the risks. They put entire companies on the line to publish particular writers. It was less a question of how they could monetize them, although they were all capitalists. They weren't primarily driven by monetizing their authors. So it's hard to find people like that. Two of them had a certain amount of family wealth. John Calder, his family owned a lot of timberland in Scotland, but also owned a brewery. And Barney had a pretty substantial allowance from his family as well. So they were fairly wealthy people, but they were willing to put it all on the line, and I say the same thing even when I'm teaching graduate students who are about to write dissertations. What's at risk here? What's really matter? What really matters? I mean, if you don't do this work, what happens? If the answer is nothing, then maybe do something else for a living. But are you taking a risk?
Yeah.
Barney did, John Calder did. Giraudias a little bit less, because he was sort of hiding in Paris and publishing in English for a trans-channel smuggling market.
Yeah. And this book came out about 20 years ago. This was kind of like another thing. Do you remember, did you just kind of, they had the book kind of edited already, and you just kind of put through an introduction on there? I got a call from Morgan Entrican, who had taken over Grove Press, finally, after the Gettys had run it into the ground a bit. And he had been working with Atlantic Monthly Press, and they were going to do this merger with Grove and Atlantic Monthly, two sort of left-leaning presses. So Morgan calls me up and says, we want to do something to mark the 50th anniversary
of Grove Press as an independent publisher. What should we do to mark the press? Well, the logical choice was to do the best of a Grove Press reader. And so Morgan said, well, how long would it take you to put together? Do you have to go to the libraries? Do you have to go to research libraries? Do you have to go abroad? And I said, I could do the whole thing sitting on my sofa, because all the Grove Press books are on the wall behind me. I've been collecting them. I've been collecting them for 50 years. So they're all right here. If anyone else wanted to do the book, they'd have to come to my library. So I was able, and basically, you have a short turnaround time when you're dealing with commercial publishers. So I tended to focus on my favorite parts of all of those books.
All right.
Yeah, so it's pretty subjective. It's not exactly a survey of what were the best portions of these books. They happen to be the things that stuck in my head.
Yeah, because when I was in New York in the 90s, it was Morgan was there, Morgan Entrican, and Ira Silverberg, and Getty had sold it off to who is that? Who's that guy? It was some family from Kentucky that bought it, I think, off of and Getty.
Yeah.
And
Morgan was their front guy.
And Morgan, I think Morgan, I mean, he's a great guy, but I think his big claim to fame was he published Cold Mountain and it won the National Book Award. I mean, it definitely wasn't the Barney Grove, it was a little bit different.
Right.
And there's been a few books about Barney, like this one, Rebel Publisher, which is good. I didn't know it existed till about a year ago, and then Barney actually wrote his own biography. I mean,
that autobiography of Barney is very complicated, because what I have there is at Florida State University, all my Grove Press material now is on deposit at Florida State University Rare Books and Archives.
Yeah, but I was. Oh, go ahead.
The interesting thing is that Barney has had maybe 5 different biographers, and I was one of them for a while. And we all reached a point where Barney fired us, because he began to think that these people think they know more about my life than I do. So Barney wanted a particular kind of book written, and the rest of us, had different perspectives that we wanted to bring to the fore. So finally, after Barney fired all of his biographers, I mean, I was at any number of parties with him, and he keeps introducing me as his biographer.
Well, that's what he said. I mean, when I interviewed him around 97, I used to go over there and visit him and play pool with Barney, and Astrid was there, and Mike Top and Ken Jordan, and Barney, like I did a little mini interview and I also transcribed the Feltrinelli interview in this book.
Yep.
I don't know how. I mean, they must have got it from Barney, I guess. And then, but Barney, like I asked him about Cuba and did he go down there with a fake passport? And he kind of denied everything. And then he said, well, and then, different things. And you go, well, Stan knows about this. He kind of, at that time in 97, he considered you the biographer, as I remember.
Yeah.
And even though I was just asking him a few general questions, and you could see my interview with Barney on the Portable Infinite, and he denied a lot of things which he later admitted in this book to be true, like having
I mean, the real issue, part of the reason why he had such a conflict is he thought his real story was his high school years, being on the football team and all those things. And the rest of us try to convince him, nobody really gives a crap about that, Barney. It's a Grove Press story. So if you look at the autobiography, there's a lot more about those early years. And actually, John Oakes, who was an early publisher with Grove and then formed his own publishing company, sort of rescued the book and put together Barney's ramblings into a kind of coherent autobiography, semi-coherent autobiography. And at the end of that book, he tells something of the story of about how it all came together. But the big difference was, Barney thought the real story was his high school years because he went to this progressive school in Chicago, which let people develop their own curriculum.
Yeah, he talked about that, and he talked about China a lot. He was really
Yeah,
into China.
that's the other thing he wanted a lot. That he was for Mao when the official American position was for Chiang Kai-shek.
So you gave up. You were going to write the biography of Grove, and then you gave up because of Barney was like so hard to deal with.
Well, there are a lot of issues I was less interested in than other people were. I mean, I really didn't care how kinky Barney's sex life was. I mean, okay, if you look at the opening scene to the filmed biography called Obscene, you can find plenty of people interested in his sex life. But I kept thinking that the real story was Grove Press. That's the lasting story.
Yeah, you wanted to stick with the Grove. Well, let me ask you this. Okay, so you spent a lot of time writing about Bergson. I mean, is he like your go-to philosopher? Just kind of like bringing the themes of all your entire work together, or is it just kind of a minor interest?
No, it's a major interest, but more where it leads. And where it leads is to Gilles Deleuze.
Okay.
And I think that when you deal with Timothy Murphy wrote this really interesting book on Burroughs called Wising Up the Mark. But he talks about Burroughs's amodernism. And what he likes to do is talk about amodernist philosophers as well. And Gilles Deleuze is one of those people who are incurably contrarian. Negri, a couple of other people he sees in this sort of amodernist category with Burroughs. And so Bergson really leads me to Deleuze because it's Deleuze who revived Bergson in about 1968 or so with this book on Bergsonism. And Bergson is really a central figure in the cinema books that Deleuze does. Cinema 1, Cinema 2, go back to Bergson again. But this notion of a kind of continuous flow, I think, influences Beckett. I mean, Burroughs is just one long writing project from beginning to end, a 40-year writing project, that he comes back to, redoes, turns upside down, inside out. So that notion of durée, or sort of continuation, the lack of segmentation in thought as one continuous river rather than a whole series of individual moments. I think that's what Endgame finally is about.
Okay. And then you had a book, Beckett's Decadent Turn. What was going on there? What was that? Was that kind of like a final word on the Beckett?
Well, I mean, what it does is take what I tried to do with that is take Beckett out of a lot of assumptions that have ossified, like Beckett as an existentialist and all that. I think it's a lot of crap.
Right.
But I think this still professionally unproduced play, Eleutheria, in which he rejects all of the bourgeois values and accepts something like, I mean, you can call it all kinds of different things, a bohemianism, but decadence seemed to me the right term to talk about the way Beckett resisted the conventions of his day. And I think this play, Eleutheria, you know, puts on stage the physical rejection of all that boulevard theater, all that Broadway, West End stuff.
And I mean, I heard you talking before in another interview about Max Nordau and his book Degeneration. Like, how did
Yeah.
was
I mean,
was Beckett influenced by that, or he was aware of it?
well, what you have to separate is a lot of the thematic material that's in Degeneration, which finally leads to unfortunate instances of cultural planning and rejection of difference among people. I think you can draw a pretty clear line between that book and the Nazi atrocities. But any number of 20th century writers were interested in this problem of difference from the normal. And I think, Beckett read the whole book very carefully, but what he liked particularly were these peculiar use of language. And what he did was like what Joyce did with a lot of work. He rated certain works for their language. And I think that's what he takes away from Nordau and his Degeneration, even though the whole notion of bloodlines and the like, runs through Yeats. There's an awful lot of bad thinking among the modernists, including T.S. Eliot, Wyndham Lewis, William Butler Yeats, and the like. I mean, there was a sort of fascist thread.
Did they think that they were elitist or something, or they were kind of protected?
Well, I mean, I think Yeats very much was resistant to the lumpen proletariat, the masses, and finally is quite elitist himself.
Yeah, because if you look at the later Dickens or the late Victorian novels of Thomas Hardy, I mean, there's like the structure. Art. I mean, at the time in the 19th century, a lot of art was supposed to be like inspirational and support the state kind of thing, like the religion,
moral values.
Art. People thought that art had to support religion and the state and stuff. And then I think when you get to something like Oscar Wilde or Huysmans Against Nature, I mean there were probably guys, and even in the novels of Hardy, you see how the mainstream society doesn't really work for some people, especially women, and the early maybe homosexual people, like just thinking like, okay, well, we're left out of this whole narrative that's going on. And I think decadence is maybe a proper answer to that, because like you're not included into mainstream society back in the 1870s or whatever.
Right. Yeah, and I think that Beckett's first full-length completed play, Eleutheria, was about that. And part of the point I make in the Beckett and Decadence book I think at some point, although he promised that play to Barney, when Barney finally got fired from Grove Press in 1986, he finally couldn't translate it. So that caused a big conflict because some of us, I kept pressing Barney, you can make another big breakthrough by publishing this book. And I did an early translation of Eleutheria. And the estate said, no, it wasn't good enough. And they kept rejecting translators until finally Barney said, I'm just going ahead with this. And, that's the most characteristic part of Barney's personality. Everything was against him. He was about to cut off his last supply of income by publishing this. And he said, it just has to be done. Ken Carroll had the great phrase about Barney that he has a whim of steel. And, whether or not it made sense, if Barney was going ahead with it, he went ahead with it. And he went ahead and published this book. The estate cut off the last of his income, but it's a landmark book.
Well,